Thank you, Christopher. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Landhuis, and I am the director of the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center that we call SPARC for ease. And I am going to be your moderator and facilitator today, and I will be working with the three panelists that you see before you. A couple of quick housekeeping things in addition to what Christopher said. The first one is that if you or someone you know is experiencing stalking, please access the information that is on SPARC's website for finding hotline information and service providers in your area. SPARC does not provide direct services to survivors, so please access the information on our website for that information that can be helpful in accessing services. The other thing that I wanted to let you all know is that this webinar is being recorded. It's going to be available on SPARC's website. So please do not put any personal disclosures in the chat because it's not confidential, nor please don't use that to highlight any particular cases or talk about survivors' experiences because it's going to be put up on a public space. That said, if you'll use the chat space to please reserve it for questions that you have for our panelists, that makes it a little bit easier for myself and our panelists to monitor the questions. So if you'll reserve that chat space for any questions that you have for our panelists, that would be helpful. The other thing that we obviously want to highlight for everyone is that these survivors will be highlighting their personal experiences. And so recounting those and listening to those might be traumatic for folks. So please take care of yourself and access those resources available on our website for support. And then the last thing that I want to highlight for everyone, well, actually two things. Number one, folks always reach out to SPARC to ask us if we're going to provide a certificate of attendance for this webinar. We will not be providing certificates of attendance for this webinar. There's a lot of you who are attending, and we just don't have the bandwidth to do that for this particular webinar. And then last but not least, I just want to say that these survivors are accounting their personal experiences. So this is not meant to be an endorsement or a criticism of any one system or one approach. This is their experiences. And so without further ado, I want to introduce you all to our panelists. I also need to let you know that SPARC is funded by the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. And the information presented today by the panelists are their opinions and are not reflective of the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. So I would like to introduce our three panelists for today. Joining me, and please help me thank them for their courage and their willingness to share their situations with all of us. I'm joined today by Matthew Herrick, Deja Washington, and Caitlin Mathis. So we're going to start our time together, first off, by letting our panelists introduce themselves and give you a little bit of a background about their particular situation. So Matthew, do you want to go ahead and get us started?
Yes, sure thing. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Herrick. I'm going to give you sort of a quick Cliff's Notes version on the experience I had. Back in 2017, I was in a relationship with an individual. And during that time period, it was a very short-lived relationship, about 9 or 10 months. I ended the relationship. From the ending of the relationship, I quickly saw someone spiraling out of control. It went from simply showing up unannounced to my home and my job, sort of frantic, begging for me to take him back, for me to have conversations with him, grab coffee, and then began to escalate as I started to create more and more boundaries around that. He started to show up drunk and belligerent, refusing to leave. It quickly escalated into a position where I had to get an order of protection against this person. They started physically stalking me, texting me from random burner numbers saying, like, how's your coffee, when I was walking home from the park. This all happened in New York City, mind you. He was then turned to impersonations as another form of power and control over me. He started impersonating me on different social media accounts alongside calling and canceling my debit cards and credit cards. Um, he would impersonate me when I would change my phone number and get my information so that he would start texting me again. From there, he started spoofing his number all the time. And then he started doxing me through the stalking. He specifically utilized the stalking through impersonating me on multiple dating apps. Uh, he specifically used a dating app called Grinder to utilize my personal image and my information, personal information, my height, my eye color, what I was wearing, so on and so forth, to create real life encounters, and also to collect information about me, my whereabouts. So he would create these profiles that would they would incite different types of sexual violence, that I was looking for rape fantasies, that I was hosting orgies, that I was HIV positive, that I wanted to buy or sell drugs. He was also inciting racial violence in different ways. And while he was doing this, he was handing out my home and job address. So over a 10-month period, he was able to send over 1,100 people to my home under the guise that they thought that they were meeting me, but it was him the entire time. He would mock me through spoofing numbers. He would hand out my phone number, and I would wake up with 75 texts from random numbers that I did not know. Uh, he did everything and anything he could to control the narrative and the autonomy of my entire being every second of every day. Throughout this process, the district attorney got involved. I was denied to file police reports. I was originally denied to even get an order of protection. Nobody understood what I was experiencing and what was happening. He started to spoof emails after he got an order of protection against me, and he actually had me arrested multiple times, one which I was held in a jail cell for 8 hours and an investigation room, even though there was an open investigation with the district attorney's office. Uh, Throughout this entire experience, the district attorney did not know how to prosecute these crimes because they were not only happening in real life and violations of the order of protection, but they were also happening through the doxing, which was creating these real life harms in many different capacities. So it took an entire year to have this man arrested and put behind bars. It took about 6 months before law enforcement would allow me to file police reports that were detail oriented and documented. And then eventually there was a grand jury indictment against him. Stalking was obviously one of 17 charges that were brought against him. He had 7 felonies, 10 misdemeanors. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but they gave him a promise sentence for being a first-time offender for 4 years. He had already served 2 behind bars waiting for his trial. He only served another 6 months, and then he was freed after 2.5 years and spent the last year and a half on probation. And now he is a free man. Throughout that entire experience, it turned into different types of stalking, from real life stalking of knowing where I was at all times and taunting me, controlling all different aspects of my life, making me feel completely unsafe in no matter what type of environment I was in. And then he took it to digital, where he was stalking me through social media, through dating apps, through anything and everything he could to weaponize technology against me and not sort of, turn my world upside down. But we got to the end. It wasn't the most what I wanted the experience to be in the sense of the outcome, but there was an outcome, and it sort of just indicates how ill prepared our criminal justice system is in prosecuting these types of crimes, these digital crimes, and how we are navigating it now in 2025. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I know a little bit later in the webinar, we're going to be talking about some of those different experiences that you had both online and in person, and how those contributed to the response that you had from individuals who were tasked with increasing your safety and the accountability of your offender. So thank you for sharing that. Deja, would you like to give us a background on your situation?
Yes, thank you guys so much for having me here and being here and committing to, making this process better. My situation started in January of 2014, And it started with me going on 2 dates with a gentleman. And by the second date, I had made the decision that I was not going to see this person anymore. And when I let him know that, he said, okay, everything was fine. He said, no problem. I let him know I had school and other things to focus on. He said, that's fine. He had stuff to focus on too. And then a month later, he decided that that wasn't good enough. He had reached out to me and let me know that he had actually changed his mind. He had thought about it, and he was a good man and he deserved a chance. And initially, I just blew it off because, what do you say when someone says to you, hey, you know what? Actually, I thought about it and I deserve a chance because I'm a good person. But then the messages became much angrier and they started to increase in frequency. So by the time it was the end of March, I was receiving, 15 to 20 messages. Within 2 weeks, it increased to receiving hundreds of text messages a day. Um, he would just download new applications every time I blocked a phone number and start texting me from that phone number. And it wasn't until he started showing up outside of my house or taking pictures of the outside of my house and sending them to me that I figured, okay, now it's time to file a police report. In between in between March and April, I probably filed at least 3 police reports. And eventually I had to move from my apartment building because it was just becoming a little bit too much. I tried to petition for a restraining order, and because we had gone on dates, they decided that it was a domestic issue and they sent me to family court. And so I'm sitting in the same room as people who have been in relationships with people for years, and I've gone on 2 dates with this person. So it made it a little bit more difficult to get a restraining order. By the time it was May, I had decided that, okay, I definitely need to move. He would have he would be outside of my house and take pictures of me filing police reports and would taunt me and tell me that, like, all the police had to do was look up and they would have seen me. It was a joke to him. I finally was able to move, and I'm like condensing this down very much because I was losing jobs at this time because he would show up at these jobs. Um, I was finally able to move in June, and I hadn't changed my phone number just yet because a part of me felt like, why should I have to change my phone number? I'm already moving. Why should I have to do this? And I received a text message from my previous landlord that let me know that they had found holes in the walls of my apartment and that there were going to be charges that I had to pay. And they sent over a link, and I clicked the link, and it ended up being like an IP address grabber. And it turns out that he was pretending to be the landlord of my previous apartment so he could find out where my new home was. I would receive packages, completely empty packages that he would put on it, do not forward, address correction requested, hoping that the post office would return the package to him with my corrected address on it. It was after those 2 instances where I was like, okay, I have to change my phone number because at this point I was being driven crazy. I remember receiving empty packages and immediately like running to the bathtub and putting water on them because I was thinking that there was a tracker. Um, at this time, I was maybe 22, so I had all of the social medias, and he would find me on them and just create 5 to 10 profiles every time I blocked it. Once it got to like 15 profiles, I would just delete the whole social media. So throughout this time, I'm becoming more and more isolated because I can't really trust anything or anyone. And I finally had a detective assigned to my case, and the detective, when he showed up, I had a huge packet of all of the interactions, all the police reports, all the petitions, pictures that the stalker had sent me from the process server, leaving notes on his door. They would say things like, "What you're trying to do is stupid," and a restraining order is just a piece of paper. I had this giant folder that I showed this detective, and the detective said to me that maybe I was taking it the wrong way. He had spoken to this person and he seemed like a nice guy. And it was at that point that I knew that, like, oh man, this man's escalating to the point where he's telling me that if I don't if I'm not in a relationship with him, he's going to kill me, and he's going to get away with it. And it was at that point that I realized that, like, oh, he's going to, like, he's telling me the truth. And I decided to get a firearm. And so this is like July. I've known this person for 2 days or 2 dates at this time. Um, but I knew him like a significantly time longer as the stalker. And so um, around July, August, I get last few emails from him letting me know that he's tired of, playing games. He's going to make good on his promise. He's going to kill me and he's going to get away with it. And I registered to vote and it made my address public, and he found me. And he showed up to my house in September at 1 o'clock in the morning and kicked the door in, and I was forced to shoot him in self-defense. Um, Very, very long story short, he ended up going to prison. He was sentenced to 8 years. He served 4, and they put him inside of a fireman's camp, so not like true prison or anything like that. And as soon as he got out and got off parole, he contacted me again and let me know that he knew where I lived in a new state and was going to find me again. He ended up stalking someone else shortly after that and returned to the same fire camp for 15 years. So that experience changed my entire life, the entire trajectory. And so since then, I've shared my story to kind of help empower survivors and hopefully advocate for better prevention and response measures. So thank you guys for listening to that.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Deja. I hope you're all seeing some of the responses that are coming up through the emojis in the webinar, where folks are expressing their support and definitely want to make sure that you all hear that they're thanking all of you for your bravery in sharing your lived experience and for letting us know what had happened in your situations. So we'll take a little bit of a deep breath and then we'll move on to Caitlin. And just a reminder, if you all would use the chat to be able to ask the panelists questions, we'll try to get to your questions today. So you can go ahead and put those in the chat as Caitlin tells us a little bit about her lived experience.
Hey guys, my name is Caitlin Mathis. I was here on this webinar last year, so I'm really grateful to be back. But I'm here as a survivor of stalking. But 8 years ago, my stalker took the life of an innocent woman, Jackie Vandergriff, who attended a university in the same town that I attended university. And I didn't know Jackie. I would have been lucky to, but in 2016, I dated a man for less than 3 months. When I was 18 and he was 29, I know that was my first red flag, but I began to pick up on other red flags in the relationship. I knew something wasn't right about him. And so about like 2 months into the relationship, I took efforts to end the relationship, but that's when he showed up at my mom's house. And this was like right before I moved off to college. So it was probably about like a week and a half until I moved off to my own place. And so whenever I got back with him, whenever he showed up to my mom's house, he convinced me to get back with him and give him a second chance, even though deep down I knew I wasn't really giving him a second chance. I was just kind of stalling because I knew he wasn't going to be able to find out where I lived once I got to college. But that obviously was not accurate. He showed up to my dorm during first flight week, which is the week before classes start. And that's when I first had to make a report with the police. So it's like a Thursday before classes start, and we're all in our dorm room with my suite mate, my roommate, and then a bunch of other girls from our floor. And there's a knock on the door. And I just think it's an RA. And I open the door and it's him. And everyone in the room knew my situation, that I was trying to get out of this relationship. And they reacted pretty much the same way that I did, like jaw dropped, like, oh my gosh, he's here. And So I wasn't expecting that, and he just asked to go into the common room, and we talked, and that's when my RA got involved, because one of the girls in my room, she contacted the RA, and my RA then proceeded to, well, she didn't proceed, she prompted me to file a report. And that's what really where all the dominoes start. And so whenever I make that police report with UNT police on campus, I'm informed that who I'm reporting it on, he was arrested the night before. And so that means that he was lurking around on campus without me realizing it. And so I had a law enforcement officer actually connect the dots to me being stalked before I knew I was being stalked. He educated me on what stalking is and how it acts as a crime, as it's a felony. And there were other things that he informed me of harassment and just the whole process. I wasn't left to figure it out on my own. I was provided with next steps. And so it's pretty crazy for someone that's experiencing stalking to receive the kind of help that I did. And I am forever grateful for it, but I am here today so that we can do better for other cases. Most victims don't get that's the same kind of help that I did. I mean, I'm a white cisgender female, and so I definitely think that plays an advantage of getting the kind of help that people deserve, but there shouldn't be discrimination. And so we're still seeing cases not handled correctly. And so that's why I'm here, as well as to show what the behavior of stalking can lead to, as it can lead to other violent crimes. But during all of this in college, I was kept safe. And so my stalker never really got the chance to get me alone. He had the chance to get someone else alone. And so he took advantage of her. And as much as I wish I could have warned her, I mean, I wouldn't have known to warn her. He did some pretty sick things in regard to him reaching out to me. He actually used her phone after he killed her to add me on Facebook. I didn't respond back to that request for multiple days after, but whenever her name came out in the news, it was quite a shock to know, like, why are these dots connecting when they shouldn't have been. But just want to say I'm grateful to be speaking here in front of you all today. And I really appreciate that we get to continue and participate in these discussions to just better how I feel, as well as better just the situations and better outcomes for future victims, and prevent future victims from becoming victims.
Thank you all so much. I am monitoring the chat. I see some of your questions come up. So know that we're going to try to be responsive to all of those questions, as well as highlight some of the things that the panelists and I had discussed prior to our webinar today. So one of the things that we want to go into next is to talk a little bit about some of those things that you were all posing in the chat. What were the things that were helpful? Why were these barriers in place? I do want to acknowledge that all of our panelists were in different areas of the country as far as the criminal codes and criminal responses. As we said at the beginning of this webinar, this isn't a criticism of any particular individuals, but rather a reflection of what these individuals went through and their personal experiences, so that all of them have the motivation, and we talked about this before the webinar, in trying to bring this to light so that we can affect change in the response to stalking and the things that they would like to have seen done differently in their cases so they could have gotten those responses. So one of the things that I also want to highlight is just the fact that we do have different definitions when it comes to stalking. We do know that a lot of times when we're referring to stalking, many of you had put in the chat things like, well, how come people weren't recognizing this right away? Why were the dots not being put together that this was a stalking situation? And really trying to focus on the fact that when we're looking at stalking situations, we see a variety of different responses, and we see many times that both individuals who are experiencing stalking and those of us who are tasked with preventing and responding to these issues don't necessarily recognize what stalking is. So just a quick reminder on the slideshow there, what we define stalking as, but I really want to get to our next piece of information. And Matthew, I'd love to start with you. There were folks who were putting in the chat, that the variety of tactics that the offender in your case engaged in and the technology that was used in your particular case is kind of shocking to a lot of folks. But I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about what you wish people, either people in general or people who are responders who are on this webinar, knew about stalking. Like what are the things that you wish they would keep in mind in cases like yours?
Yeah, so in reference to like my particular experience, um, a lot of times we think of stalking as very like an isolated form of abuse where we think of like the physical aspect of it all. My case, it became extremely digital, and it was accompanied both by orders of protection and being wrapped up in the family court system. He found a way to navigate the physical stalking, which he was still doing from afar, but he was able to utilize the impersonations as a form of stalking and a form of control over my life by garnering more and more information about me through the interactions he had pretending to be me. I know it seems very confusing when I say that, but um, basically, he would utilize the interactions that I had with people that were showing up to my home and job, and he would gather whether or not I was actually at my job or I was actually at my home, because within the process I was told to change my schedule. Um, so my schedule was completely different than what he knew it to be before. So now he was losing a little bit of control. So now he was utilizing other people to gather that information if he wasn't physically able to do it in person. Um, I think that with stalking, we look at it as just that form, but stalking really is about power and control, manipulation, gaslighting, fear, and all of those things combined. That when he moved it over to doxing, um, he was even in more control. He was weaponizing my images, whether they be sexually explicit images online and posting them through the chats and dating app profiles. He would also use it to send my address out. So it was always letting me know that he was there. So when he would send, I think it was I had 23 people show up to my home and job in one day under the impression that they were going to have some sort of sexual, physical encounter with me. Um, that was a form of him letting me know that he was always around. And that is a form of stalking. With these types of digital stalking, it's much harder to just say like, oh, well, stalking in the third or whatever. I mean, he got something, I think it was stalking in the third, but it was really collecting the digital evidence surrounding the different forms of physical abuse he was inflicting on me through the digital world. So when he was doxing, we know doxing is a non-prosecutable crime, but the physical real harms that were happening from it that he was inciting was a prosecutable crime. It's just that with that digital evidence, collecting it and having it and connecting it with our criminal laws that are in place right now is extremely difficult.
I want to take this opportunity to ask you, Matthew, because there were a couple questions that popped up in the chat. So if it's okay with you, I'd like
Of course.
give you the opportunity to answer them. So one person just posed the question, like, do you think the response was different? And did you feel like the bias or discrimination that folks maybe had because of your relationship with a stalker was part of the response or lack of response in your particular case? In particular, this person is asking, do you think that folks were biased because you're part of the LGBTQ community?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I had faced so much adversity trying to file police reports. I was, the term faggot was pretty well thrown out there. Deal with it like a man, and I pardon my language, but I just have to be very honest with everyone. Um, they didn't understand it. They were very unwilling to understand it, not only because I am a gay man, but because I am a man. It seemed like something that was not their problem. I remember getting into arguments with officers where I was just pleading for my life, pleading for help. And I remember specifically an incident where the one of the detectives pulled me in a room and he said, realistically, what do you actually want from us? What do you want us to do? He was trying to be kind in that moment, but also dismissing me and not allowing me to file police reports. It wasn't until I had put up a public post on Facebook, somebody just randomly knew the district attorney for the domestic violence unit in New York City and gave me their phone number, emailed them directly, and said that I would be reaching out, that my case was actually taken on. So law enforcement had no interest. I was up in West Harlem at the time, and they had no interest. It took months and months of criminal investigation for that particular precinct and the precincts all over New York City to understand the gravity of the situation and get involved. That was also affected by a very public civil lawsuit. So everyone was sort of on red alert. But I think that's something that we need to acknowledge just in general, the adversities that are faced from the most marginalized group, people of color, the LGBTQ community, but also, I see the adversities because I work in different capacities with people who are being stalked, and they are in the sex work industry and they are not being acknowledged as a human being. So they're facing their own type of adversity. So that is a huge hurdle that we need to acknowledge with each individual victim or survivor in any sort of case, is that the adversities that the blonde, blue-eyed girl is facing is very different than the gay man or trans woman or whatever the case may be. So it does create major hurdles, and it also creates adversity in seeking out any sort of justice or help throughout the process.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
Yep.
Deja, I want to switch to you really quick, just to reflect more on the, what do you wish people knew about stalking? And then I have a couple of questions that folks had posed to you in the chat as well. So your overall thoughts about that particular question?
Yeah, what I wish they knew about stalking is that it can happen to anyone. I think that there's a dangerous assumption that, hey, well, what did you do to this person? Which is how I was made to feel like, well, what did you do to them? But this person fixated after 2 weeks, and there's nothing that I could have done to have been more clear. There was no leading on or playing games or anything like that. This person fixated. So it can happen to anyone. And then I think I would just challenge people to pay attention to their language. I think I hear a lot of times things like, oh, I was stalking their Facebook profile, or, and we're using it in a very cavalier way of like, oh, hey, maybe you lingered, or maybe you like went too far down their Instagram profile, you liked something from 2018. Like that's very different than someone deciding that you are their full-time job. And I I have messages of this person being like, you are my full-time job. Maybe I can get you to kill yourself. Like that's a very different thing. So I would just say like be aware of that language and try your hardest not to participate in it, because I think it makes it seem like it's a joke, like it's funny, or it's something that you should be flattered by. Like, oh no, it's not flattering. It's frightening. Um, that might be the biggest thing. And then what I don't think a lot of people pay attention to is that if someone is engaging in stalking, then they probably have a level of understanding with the system that we don't really give enough credit for. My stalker, I don't like saying my, because I don't want to own any of that, but like the stalker knew that he could get away with things. He would send me memes and like little infographics that were like, X amount of percent of criminals escape justice just by crossing state lines, just like little things like that. He knew how far he could push and that no one would take it seriously. So I think, especially in the context of sentencing, when we are operating under the assumption that like, oh, there's this person is not a threat outside of this this person that they're focusing on at the time, I think that's a very like dangerous idea to have in your brain. Not only are they highly aware of what they're doing, but it can happen to anyone. And especially in my case, even though he fixated on me to the point where I had to shoot him, he started the moment he was off of parole, and then he started stalking someone else. And so it's like, if it was taken more seriously, could that person have been prevented from being stalked?
Thank you, Deja. And I see some folks, pivoting to what might be helpful, and we're going to get to that in just a second. But I also want to give Caitlin a chance to answer the question about, what she wished people knew about stalking. But Deja, I want to ask you really quick, because someone had asked in the chat, was there a certain point in time when, or was there a particular event that kind of flipped the switch for you from this was concerning behavior to, oh, I think this is stalking behavior? Or was that more of a nuance?
Initially, you're just like, someone sends you a message where they're like, hey, I thought about it. You're like, okay, whatever, you blow it off. It wasn't until I started waking up to like, you get 20 messages in a row and you're like, okay, this is weird. But when I started getting pictures of the outside of my house and there was no way he could have got that information, it was like, okay. And then it progressively escalated to where if he couldn't reach me, he was like sending me maps of my parents' house, which is like, how did you even find this information? And being like, well, if you won't answer me, I guess I'll have to pay a visit. And that's horrifying to me. My dad lives alone and he's paralyzed from the chest down. And so it's like, once it got to that point, which is already very far, it was okay. This is very different than, someone just playing around with me. And the frequency, it was like this person had no time to do anything else. There were so many messages and so many things that you're like, how do you have this much time? Once you realize someone's spending that much time to make your life a living hell, it gets really clear really fast.
Thanks, Deja. I think that was echoed by folks in the chat, recognizing that in all of you, that the intensity of these particular situations, the means to which the offenders in your situations went to gain control and to engage with you, I think is being highlighted for a lot of folks. So thank you for sharing that particular experience. Caitlin, I want to switch to you to ask you to answer this particular question about what you wish folks would know, and then we'll address some of the other questions in the chat.
Of course. So for me, the experience of stalking, it went on for a month and a half. It really wasn't that long for me because after he had met Jackie and he did what he did, they arrested him like a couple days after. There was a few days in between, but I couldn't sleep. And so even after my stalker was in jail for his murder trial, I felt like I needed more answers. I just didn't understand how someone could do what he had done and taken the life of an innocent, beautiful young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. And I will say I let it get to me. I mean, there were days that I got home from class and I just fell on the floor and I couldn't stop crying, but my roommate and so many other people held me together. And I wouldn't have gotten through it without my village of supportive people in my life. And so just to understand like the long-term effects of stalking. So as it's going on, it's especially for Deja and Matthew, you feel powerless and helpless, and there's so many things you want to do, and it's scary to know that these people are just lurking when you're not even realizing it. And so I'm glad that I didn't have to experience that for a long time. and that law enforcement actually took action. I'm forever grateful for that, but I understand that that feeling still persists. And then I also remember feeling overwhelmed, not ready to share. So when I was going through all this in 2016, I did not want my name associated with any of this. I wanted to live a normal life as a college student. Even though I was hearing people talking about me, but not realizing they were talking about me. And so it just like made me feel a little different. But like I said, I had those supportive people in my life to really help get me through it. And so, but that feeling of hyper awareness, it stays. That's the big thing. And so for me, I become that friend that's like a mom, and I go out of my way to make sure that my friends make it home safe. And I would get on to my friends whenever they would go home with a random, I don't think I would even allow it, but I would remind them, like, you do not go home with someone that you just met. Because that's how Jackie lost her life. And she didn't have any clue of the kind of guy that he was. And she wouldn't have. These kind of people, they put on these facades of them being a nice person, and they're charming, and it's just very surprising, like, oh, I don't think this person would do that. Like, they don't have bad intentions, but they know how to be two-faced. And so I think that's also an issue. And then I really want people to grasp the idea of like homicide in slow motion is what stalking is. And I think we hit on this point last year, but it just goes to show like what this behavior leads to. And if we can do our part to prevent it, to bring awareness to it, to call it out, I think that's what we need to just keep doing.
To that point, Caitlin, there was also someone in the chat that wanted to know, you mentioned the word hypervigilance. Has there been anything that's helped you with that sense of hypervigilance, or anything that you access that helps you, continue to cope with the impact of what happened?
I work out a lot. That's definitely helped. But
we've also talked a little bit about how there were some resources that were set up for you that eventually, when you felt like you could access them, were helpful. Do you want to talk a little bit about those at all?
Yeah. So whenever I was experiencing the stalking at UNT, I actually had the dean of students reach out to me about setting up an appointment with someone at the Denton County Courthouse so that I could apply for a protective order.
Okay.
It was as simple as that. They said, if you want this appointment, we can get it set up, just let us know. And so there was like a day or two that I slept on it, and I was like, I don't want to be that person that has to like go out of there. Like, I don't want to have to do this. But it had gotten to a point where he started harassing me online and pretending to be a UNT student, and was using hashtag UNT 2020. Hashtags were like the thing back in the day. But despite that, he made these false claims that I gave him an STD. And so when it got to that point, I was just like, I thought that I might have gotten something from him, because like he like posted pictures of like actual like lab work. And I was like, what is he talking about? Like, and I did my part to be safe, but like, I mean, that's never 100%, but it freaked me out. And I thought my life was over. I don't see it that way now, but that's when it got to the point where I was like, I need to get that appointment. And I got that appointment. They set it up, I want to say less than a week. And they made the process effortless on my side. And so there wasn't any waiting for a call back. It was, let's get this appointment set up. She needs it. They advised me on it before I actually needed it, which is how it should be. Because when someone needs a protective order, they need it like right then and right there. But the process that they have to go through to get it, I mean, you've heard paperwork getting lost. That's ridiculous. Why is the process? Why can't it be as simple as the process that I went through? I mean, I understand there's a lack of law enforcement. There's a lot of different issues, especially based on demographics and area that you live in. But having that, I might not be here if I wasn't provided with those resources. So I just want to do my part so that we can see that those resources are provided to everyone. And I mean, everyone's situation is different, but to have someone on their case that can guide them through it, it shouldn't be that difficult.
Caitlin, you remind me of one of the mantras that we have at SPARC, which is that survivors shouldn't have to luck into a good response.
Yes.
That should be uniform.
Mhm.
And so pivoting from that, Matthew and Deja, you've highlighted a lot of the barriers that you encountered in your particular situations, and definitely feel free to add more to that. There were a couple of folks in the chat that were asking the two of you, since you didn't have as helpful system responses, if there were people or individuals or things that happened in your cases that were helpful to you. So I don't know which one of you wants to answer first, Deja. I can see you kind of contemplating, and it's okay to say there wasn't necessarily anything, but some other folks were saying, you know, if I had a friend in this situation, or if you had a friend in this situation, were there things that could have been helpful, or were there things that were helpful? So
Go ahead.
Deja, you can go first.
Okay. So mine was kind of like the perfect recipe. I had just moved to a completely new city alone in a new state. So I hadn't established any friends or anything like that at that point in time. And I was smiling because it's like I want to give you something and be like, hey, you know what? There was this one person who was like, this case looks weird, but no, there was none of that. There was none of that. And I filed multiple police reports to the point where they knew me on a first name basis. Like that's how much I was going to this police station. Um, and I wished that I could like tell you that there was, but it was the perfect recipe for disaster. I was in a completely new place. Like I said, my dad is in a completely different state and he's paralyzed from the chest down. So it was like, it's you out here. There is no one. He was also very charming. Things like, I remember one day getting a text message from a random number and it's like, oh, hey, um, I gave your boyfriend a ride. We're outside the gate to your apartment, but we don't have the code. Can you let us in? And he had talked a complete stranger into giving him a ride to my house. So he was that charming to where if he did talk to somebody, he was able to get information out of them. He made friends with the security guard in my apartment building. He was obviously friendly with the detective who was assigned to my case. And so that kind of really whittled me down. Every time he found me on a social media profile, you know, after blocking 10 to 15, I would just delete it. And so, you know, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller because I couldn't really like trust anyone. I couldn't trust my neighbors to like not give information or anything like that. So there was no one. I remember losing a job because I stopped sleeping and I had just been hired. I needed this job and it was the very first day and I fell asleep standing up. Like that's how exhausted I was and just whittled down to no one. So it was like the perfect recipe.
Deja, there were actually some folks in the chat who were asking about employment and wondering if you ever had an employer who had a good response, or if you could take the opportunity, if you were to wave your magic wand for employees or employers across the country, what would you ask them to do differently in a situation like that?
This is so hard because like you have to understand that at a certain level, like an employer has a responsibility to their business. And I remember after I purchased my firearm, getting hired somewhere and they're like, you can't have your firearm with you here, even though I was living in Las Vegas. And I'm like, well, I mean, I can't work here. This man is showing up and telling me that he's going to kill me. So there was no and I was embarrassed. Like I was horribly embarrassed. So there was no like, oh, hey, we kind of understand. There wasn't enough time for me to even build up that rapport because
Sure.
he would find where I was working. He would threaten me. I would have to quit. Or the last time when I was fired on the first day for falling asleep standing up. So there wasn't like a lot of time for me to build a relationship. I have no idea how I was surviving at all at this time. I look back now, I'm like, I call it the year of the jobs because I'm like, man, I was really making it work, making it
Yeah.
work out there.
Were. And I think there's a lot of acknowledgement in the chat of the links that all of you have had to go to, not only physically, but emotionally, and a lot of respect, and thankfulness in the chat for you all being willing to share your lived experience. Matthew, you want to answer this?
Yeah, of course. I think I'll start with barriers before I go into what was helpful.
Sure.
Barriers for me was definitely the filing of police reports that didn't happen for an extreme amount of time due to the fact of them denying me to do so because they didn't understand the situation, so they refused to acknowledge it. Secondly, was my barrier of getting an order of protection. I had to go to criminal court at night because family court was closed and it had been escalating so severely. The lady at the clerk wouldn't even allow me to see the judge at first, and I sat back down. Luckily, I had my sister with me, who's a total badass, and told me to go back up there and let them know that they will let me see a judge. So me in tears at 32 years old, bawling in front of this lady, begging her to see a judge because of the severity. I had my little folder of what evidence I had collected over the past couple weeks. That was a huge barrier. Um, any sort of resource guide. I mean, things have changed astronomically over the past few years, especially with like SPARC and all the things that have like created all these different resource guides, whether it be mental health, lawyers, how to navigate the criminal justice system and get an order of protection. The order of protection for me was probably the most important part of my case because every time he impersonated me online, which we were be able to get that verbiage inside of the order of protection, that he was not allowed to impersonate me, along with all the normal things of no contact, da 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 da. And that ended up being something that astronomically helped me as a foundational point because every time he impersonated me online or doxed me or whatever the case may be through those stalking methods, he was violating the order of protection. So he was just building himself right into the ground. Um, I think I mean, there would be nice if there, at the time, there was somewhere where I could go to understand how to navigate it and just navigate the system in general. What was helpful was, for me, was sheer luck, to be honest. I know I spoke about it earlier, posting on a Facebook, begging for help and being very, vocal and vulnerable in that moment and being connected to the district attorney's office was huge, which inevitably connected me to a family court lawyer. I was based in New York City at the time. Sanctuary for Families was my family court lawyer. I had a phenomenal lawyer at the time who really invested in what was going on, maybe didn't fully understand this type of crime, but showed up every day with me and went beyond um, what they could do. They also looked out for resources because I was suffering financially because I was missing work. There were different victim service providers that would give me money for like Ubers to get home so I didn't have to take the subway. Because it was, physical violence all the time. He was inevitably making sure that I would either be extremely physically hurt or killed. So things like that. But Another barrier that we encounter, and I think that it's really important to highlight within like digital violence, whether it be stalking and so on and so forth, is the barrier we deal with, like getting that digital evidence from online providers, different platforms. A lot of you know about Section 230. If you don't, Section 230 was created at the birth of the internet. It basically gives online providers complete immunity from any liability that happens on their platform. So they don't necessarily need to answer subpoenas from law enforcement or DAs. They don't necessarily need to pull, harmful content down from their platform. They can basically willingly and knowingly facilitate the crime on their platform with no recourse on our end. And sometimes they have the ability to turn it over in 24 hours or pull the harmful content down. And sometimes it exists for months, if not almost a year, and which was my case of the lack of cooperation with this particular platform. So when I talk about that, I think that like everyone should know how important it is to attempt to get that digital evidence, knowing that it is part of what will tie all the foundational items that we've created in the orders of protection and so on and so forth, so that we can properly prosecute the crimes that are being committed, but knowing that it might take a week, it might take 4 months, it might take a year, inevitably is a huge barrier that we're going to encounter, especially as we kind of lean more into, this digital violence in this day and age. Filing these very detailed police reports was astronomically helpful. Another thing that I did for myself in my hypervigilance, which we were talking about earlier, was I started recording every single interaction and moment in a book. So that meant detail-oriented descriptions of the people that I encountered, what their expectations were, height, age, weight, time of day, the date. I mean, as much as I could to show a clear outline of what was happening all the time, which was also helpful when they got the digital evidence. So those were probably the best things. I think after everything was said and done were victim services, where I did get a certain dollar amount to access mental health services. So I basically, because of the crimes that were committed against me, including stalking in New York, I acquired therapy for basically the rest of my life up to a certain dollar amount. You do have to jump through hoops because it is government and all of that, and it makes it difficult to navigate, but it's absolutely worth it. Yeah, there were a lot of different lucky situations, I call them, and I know it doesn't sound lucky, but it is, because I'm alive and standing here in front of all of you today and telling my story and giving my insights. Civil litigation was something that we went down that path. I won't go too much into that because it doesn't really fully pertain to what we're trying to discuss right now, but I did end up suing the dating app with Carrie Goldberg was my lawyer at the time. She's a victims' rights advocate or lawyer based in New York City, and that astronomically slowed down the abuse I was experiencing because of the publicness of the lawsuit, but also lit a fire under the asses of all the different law enforcement to get to grand jury and to get an indictment against this individual. So I feel like with that type of stuff, it was 2017 at the time. It was sort of little things falling into place in retrospect, looking back at the different things, like collecting as much screenshots as I could, as much anything that I thought I could screenshot or keep as evidence on my end. I would do it because in the grand scheme, the more I had, the more that I could supply to law enforcement mattered in my case. And I know that not every victim or survivor is capable of doing that, but it is something that I highly suggest. And if they're capable of doing so, it will astronomically impact the way that the criminal prosecution goes.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to ask you, you talked about documentation. There were folks in the the chat that we're echoing documentation. I'm gonna have Emma from our team link the documentation log that SPARC has available that folks can use as one of the methods in documenting these particular incidents, just as a resource. Just want to throw it out there, but also an acknowledgement, Matthew, like you said, you had to put a lot of time and effort into documenting those things and how difficult it was on you to do so. And Caitlin, I want to pivot to ask you a particular question, but it's been coming up in the chat a little bit, and several of you have mentioned it, talking a little bit about the impact on your mental health. But I also want to just interject really quickly for folks in that when we talk about stalking, a lot of times people want to immediately label offenders of stalking as having mental health issues. And the research will show you that the percentage of stalkers with documented mental health issues is actually very low. And that most of these offenders actually have issues with power and control. So please do not confuse mental health issues and power control issues. Certainly, there are a vast number of stalkers who have mental health issues, but it is not as high as people want to think it is. So the educator in me can't not say that really quickly, but I also want to focus on the mental health impact for all of you. I know, Caitlin, one of the questions that was posed in the chat, maybe you can talk a little bit more about this as well as some of the resources that you were connected with, but folks were asking about campus and community education. And so you had mentioned that there were some peers on your floor who knew what was going on, et cetera. Like, what did you find that they did that was helpful? And what other education resources, et cetera, do you think campuses should have in particular?
Yeah, of course. I mean, just getting my RA involved. The girls, they first checked on me to make sure I was okay. I was in the common room, but the fact that my RA didn't allow me to not make a report, because I was like, do we really have to? And she's like, yes, we need to. And so, but if that part of the piece if we hadn't submitted that documentation, I mean, the whole plot changes completely. And so I definitely think there needs to be more resources on campus I think they need to educate kids on this in high school. I think that they need to, I mean, even middle school, they're putting, I don't know, I saw an article recently about these people from Canada that flew down to California to track down this girl that they played video games with, and there was an attack. And so I mean, even the kids on playing video games, if they give out information, they divulge information that they shouldn't, it can really end up biting them in the butt. And if they don't know that, it could end up costing them their lives. And so I think if we can educate people at a younger age, not just college, because I mean, I'm grateful that I was provided with law enforcement that connected these dots and aided me. But I think if we have an education piece prior to that, we can also help with I mean, I was 18, I was naive. I mean, but I also had a mother that really instilled a lot of good information in me, like what to look out for when dating, because she was also dating when I was growing up. And so there definitely needs to be a push for more resources, but not just on colleges. There needs to be a push for law enforcement that connects these dots. They shouldn't be waiting for documentation to just show up on their desk. They need to actually go out there. It's not like they have to survey or anything. I mean, I think that that's something that they should consider. But I think that there's a lot more evidence that they can be gathering than they realize, especially the tech facilitated stalking stuff, the online harassment. It's oftentimes it's shrugged off as nothing, oh, just ignore it. No, people are getting hundreds of messages. You can't ignore those kinds of words. Makes your skin crawl. But there was a lot of resources that UNT provided me with. They actually provided me with counseling. They pointed me in their direction of Denton County Friends of Family, which is a domestic violence shelter that provides services And so I was provided with free counseling. And that was a huge help, just talking to someone about it and opening up about like all these details that I don't really want to share with everyone else. I mean, I'm an open book, but during that time it would have been easier to just like bottle it up than talk about it. But I knew I needed to talk about it. And so having that resource was huge. But I think that really hits on like the parts that I was provided help with. And so, oh, but also the documentation piece. Officer Polk at UNT just gave me his phone number. He said, and email address, and said, you can forward me all the correspondence and we'll document it. And so having that, and it just made the process effortless on my side. So like, and that's to me how it should be. You shouldn't be putting the victim in the middle to have to fight their own fight. Law enforcement should be guiding you step by step through that. And if law enforcement can't do it, why is there not another agency doing it? I mean, honestly, there needs to be like a task force or something with all these people having trouble just getting into the courts. You shouldn't have to fight. I mean, but that's pretty much covers it. Was there something else that I missed, Jennifer?
No, you did great. And I think along that education lines, you all are the educators for everyone on this particular webinar. So this is your opportunity to also have the chance to, what's your ask of folks who are on this call? What do you wish they would know? What piece of education do you want to bestow on all of the folks who are listening today? So Matthew, do you want to start? And then we'll take time for questions after that. But
Yeah, of course. I think I just want to echo what or reiterate what I was talking about earlier is that the adversities that each individual experiences within the realm of stalking is not the same, especially when it comes to, different marginalized communities. The treatment within these different law enforcement and how the process goes for them is doesn't mirror what the perfect victim would be in any case, because the perfect victim doesn't exist. So being aware of that and being prepared while guiding somebody through this system, that you might have to fight a little bit harder and to ask all of the questions, and not be deterred by the ignorance of these individuals. I definitely want to echo what everyone was speaking on earlier. Was language is a huge important issue within how we approach survivors or victims. There's a lot of blaming, and I don't think a lot of times it's even we don't even realize that we're doing it in the structure of the way that we're speaking or asking questions. But it is a very sensitive topic, one that I think survivors and victims kind of have that internal struggle with, of how could I end up in this place? How could I have chosen this person? Why didn't I see the signs? And there's a number of reasons why that happens, depending on emotional state of the person, gaslighting, all of the different effects of. So there's no real reason. It can happen to anyone at any time. That's just point blank period. Yeah, and I think that like understanding those other barriers that we talked about, and getting ahead of the curve, especially when it comes to any sort of collection of digital evidence, understanding the importance of that and really focusing on orders of protection. They can be at times difficult to get, but one of the most important foundational items within a criminal prosecution process. And I can speak personally on that, how important it is to have that in place and to talk with the judge about specific verbiage depending on each individualized experience, and asking them to place that in the order of protection. They will do it. They're more likely to do it now in 2025 than they were in 2017. They did it for me, and it astronomically changed the trajectory of how they aligned the different counts and felonies and misdemeanors they brought against my stalker.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.
Caitlin, what would you say?
So I definitely think asking those questions, like what Matthew was saying, is super important. As asking, even if you think it's a stupid question, it could save someone's life. And so, but also I think that there should be more that we're doing to hold law enforcement more accountable, and court officials too. Because oftentimes that's where the hangup lies in the courts. But with stalking on the rise, especially tech facilitated stalking and serial stalkers, we need a standard set of resources and regulations to hold law enforcement and court officials accountable. Guidelines that they can abide by, granted that they have the resources, but things need to be laid out so that these mishaps aren't happening, so that victims are guaranteed the resources and assistance that they need to get through this. I think that's a way for us to also aid in the discrimination part of it. Because we're continuing to see people discriminated against, the minorities. And so if we have a standard set of resources and a way to create regulations to hold these agencies, law enforcement, court officials accountable, I think that's a way that we can save lives. And education and awareness is always key. And then I'll leave it with know it, name it, stop it.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you.
Asia, love to hear from you.
Yeah, I approve of everything that has already been said. I'd say, for me, honestly, what I would ask of you is to understand that for every true crime story that you enjoy, understand that that is someone's life and someone's experience, and put yourself in that situation. What if this was happening to me? What if this was happening to my sister? What if this was happening to my brother? What what would I be feeling, and what type of support would I enjoy? I wouldn't even say enjoy, like would save my life. And then I'd say also, if you can advocate for what a victim might not know, you're already in a very high stress situation, and it's not my job to know like what laws can be enforced and what's illegal and what's not. It'd be ideal, right? Like if every victim was kind of aware, but they're not. And I know that in my situation, I was essentially bullied into not going into trial, and allowing like a plea deal, allowing for him to take a plea deal and not pushing it. And the words that were used were, well, if you make it a big deal, it'll drag this out longer than it's already been dragged out. And me being, a child, I'm like, okay, you're right. I just want this done, which again makes me feel like I did something wrong. If this were to get dragged out, okay, so what? Maybe it should be dragged out. This was something that happened to my life. I would also say, if you are in the position to make sure that the victim is updated on things, that would be incredibly helpful. I shot this person in September of 2014, and because he knew the system, even though he was in the hospital for 4 months after that, because he knew the system, he would do things like, not go to court, say, I'm not going to court. And they have to allow that a couple times before they have to force you to go to court. And so that kind of dragged things out. And so every single time a court date was scheduled, I was showing up trying to give my victim impact statement. And it happened so many times that by the time he finally went to court for the first time in July of the following year, they let him speak first. Normally they let the victim impact, they let that go first. They let him speak first. And his lawyer had created this entire narrative about how he was just this love-sick guy, and he had intended to marry me and things didn't go well, and he started doing drugs and painted this whole entire narrative. And I had to sit there and listen to this. And they had lost my paperwork. They didn't even know that I was there. So I would say, if you can advocate for them knowing, okay, hey, this is what's going on. hey, he said he's not going to court, or hey, they couldn't bring him, he's not going to be there today, because I didn't have money or time to kind of like keep taking off work to try and meet these days that he was, playing the system for. Um, and then I would say, I would say just kind of be an advocate for the victim. My protection order, despite me applying for it, wasn't served until after I shot this person in the chest. So it's like I had to do all of the work and then have officers come around and be like, "Oh, good aim." And I was just like disgusted at the entire process of now I'm 22 and I'm someone who is going through this, and I've shot a person now. Like that's a very hard thing to kind of reconcile yourself with. So I would say just truly be an advocate for victims in that sense.
Wow. Thank you, Deja, and thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Caitlin. So I'm going to give folks a chance to pose a couple more questions in the chat because we have a few minutes. And while people are doing that, I just want to highlight a couple of things for you all. First of all, we would love for you all to join SPARC on January 17th. We're going to do an Instagram live with the person who's going to receive our 2025 Peggy Klinke Award. It's an award we started giving out last year in recognition of an individual who is making an impact for survivors of stalking. So we'll be announcing that winner and celebrating that winner on January 17th. And as you've heard from our folks with lived experience on this call, taking some type of action is really important, and trying to figure out how do we boost the education on stalking. And so this year on January 18th, we are recognizing the second annual National Day of Action. And so we invite you to check this out on our social media. And every January 18th going forward, we have a campaign called Sparkle Against Stalking, which is in recognition of a victim of stalking who was killed by her offender. And her sister says in her memory that as they were experiencing that stalking, that they watched Peggy's personality fade, and that she had this beautiful sparkling personality that they wish they could get back. And so every January 18th, we do a campaign called Sparkle Against Stalking, where we encourage individuals to bring back the sparkle on behalf of Peggy and the folks that you see in front of you right now, who were brave enough to share their lived experience with all of us today. So just want to highlight those particular things for all of you. As well as refer you all to our website, which we had folks from SPARC linking a couple of things in the chat. This wasn't meant to be like a training 101. This was meant to really ground all of us as we go into Stalking Awareness Month in the lived experiences of the folks that we're working with. And so as we're looking at a few final questions, I also just want to express my personal thank you to Matthew and Deja and Caitlin for being part of this webinar. It's the webinar that I think is the most impactful one that we do every single year. And as an advocate, an educator, and director of SPARC, you have my heartfelt thank you for being on this webinar. So we're going to peek at a couple of the questions here just to see. There were a couple of folks that were asking about community-based advocates. And if any of you had interaction with a community-based advocate, as well as if you did or didn't, what are your thoughts about like a national hotline for stalking victims as opposed to like a domestic violence hotline? Deja, you highlighted that difficulty with being thrown into family court for somebody that you had 2 dates with. I'm just curious what your thoughts are about working with community-based advocates or a hotline thought, and feel free, whoever wants to answer that.
I think that any resource that will be able to get victims information as soon as possible, even if it's like what direction they can go into, and maybe even as a first, okay, here's level 1, I think is beneficial, because you're very much in the dark. So I personally think it would be good. I just think that there is a very important distinction between like DV and stalking. And I think when we lump the two together, and it's a problem, I think stalking might be minimized because it's like, oh, are you just trying to get back at your boyfriend, or are you mad at your partner? And it's like the association shouldn't be there anyway, but I just think it should be very clear that this is this specific threat.
Great, thanks. Matthew or Caitlin, anything else you would want to add? I want to make sure that I'm also looking at some of these.
I think for me, I mean, I think they're all great points. Having like a stalking hotline or any sort of community-based resource available to each individual would have astronomically changed the course of what I was trying to navigate. I didn't know how to do anything. I was just like, oh, I get an order of protection because I had people around me that were like, oh, that seems like the best option, you know? It wasn't until I had lawyers and understood what was happening to me, and had people working around me to help navigate me through all of it, and from my own research, and understanding of the systems and all of that that are in place. So I think that's a grand idea to have that. I think any sort of, it's like a how-to guide, how to survive stalking. I mean, in a lack of better terms, but truly would have been extremely helpful for me. So any sort of, whether it's community-based or a national hotline that says they can look at things in each individualized area, depending on where you are located within the United States, has any sort of resource guide within their community. I mean, I know it's a big ask, but like it would be hugely helpful, I think, for everyone, even if it was like the basic outline, because it's so debilitating, it's so overwhelming and chaotic that somebody who is a victim of these crimes cannot categorically put things in alignment with what they need to do, because they are just in complete survival mode every moment through that hypervigilance. So yeah.
Thank you, Matthew. Any closing remarks from the three of you? Anything else you want to add before we log off today?
No, just thank you, especially to everyone that's putting in the work.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here and your commitment to making this process easier.
Thank you all. I appreciate it, and I'm very grateful to be here in front of you all and speaking.
And I know I speak on behalf of everyone on the call. Thank you, the three of you, for dedicating your time and effort, and we appreciate it. All right, everyone, please check out our website for additional information as we start off a Stalking Awareness Month, which is held during the entire month of January. And we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Thank you.